Hi, my name is Brandy Larson. The graphic novel I'm analyzing is One Punch Man, Volume 1. This is a story written by One, and the art is by Yusuke Murata. The publisher is Viz Media for the book, and the weekly magazine for this series is Shonen Jump. This graphic novel is the first volume of chapters in the story of Saitama. He's an overpowered hero who is bored by his lack of emotion and desire to fight. The comic was a challenge since it's considered Japanese manga. I had to read from back to front and right to left, as this comic reads totally reverse of what I'm used to with Western comics, which are read from front to back and left to right. I found the challenge a bit difficult to start with, but once I got into the flow of how to read it, the reading went smoothly. Alright, this is a 202-page graphic novel that's not a true graphic novel. This comic started as a weekly webcomic and went viral. After the success of the webcomic, the story of One Punch Man was put into print, so that this is several chapters or several weekly stories that have been put together in a compilation called a graphic novel, or since this is a Japanese comic, it's called a manga. Here's an example of the content page for the chapters. The comic does not adhere to acts in what would be traditional for any story or comics, for that matter. There's no clear-cut Act 1, Act 2, and so on. It also doesn't adhere to the quarter, half-quarter pacing of what comics are supposed to follow. Each chapter is its own individual story, and each story follows its own storyline from beginning to middle to end. The stories don't really intersect except towards the end of this particular volume. Each story seems to stand on its own and have its own merits. There is a continuous theme throughout each, however, which is boredom and lack of interest in life by our hero Saitama. As far as story arcs go, for each story presented, there is a repetitive theme. Saitama changes slightly through each story and gains some brief understanding of why he is the way he is and where he came from. Each story has definite resolution. As our hero overcomes the monster or monsters he encounters, at the end of each, however, he is still bored and a bit apathetic, which is where he starts each new story, and he seems to remain this way. He hasn't really found his reason for living as a superhero. He's just one because he's strong and he cares about justice. So while there is small growth for this character, there is no real character arc for him in this particular volume. This comic is a classic good versus evil, and good overcomes the challenges. This can pose a problem, but there's finally a character introduced who wants to learn from Saitama in the Cyborg chapter, and this is where the story starts to move from one story into the next with an underlying bigger storyline. The Cyborg has a bigger character arc than Saitama, who the series is about. The Cyborg has a mission, and while he is diverted from his original mission, he encounters Saitama, who saves him and then fixes himself after almost being killed. He tells Saitama his backstory and then pledges to learn from a master who also saved his life, and to continue with his original mission to find justice for his own town and family. The story has several different transitions, and they all seem to be quite effective. This page is a nice example of panel-to-panel transition. There is a lot of action in this comic, but as far as the transitions go, this page is the one showing the action-to-action transition most clearly that I found. The most clear subject-to-subject transition I found is this page for an example. Scene-to-scene transition shows best in the bonus manga 200 Yen, which is a story from when Saitama was 12 years old and in junior high school. Aspect-to-aspect transition shows clearly on these two pages that I have selected. With all the action sequences and the transitions, while I'm sure there were more, they weren't as clear as I would have thought. I had to really search and look for good examples of each of the types of transitions. I did not find any examples of the non-sequitur transitions. All the transitions I found were related in some form or fashion from one panel to the next, and the prior examples that I've shown here are the transitions that this particular author and artist have used for this comic. Page as a mini-comic is rather sketchy for this particular comic, in my opinion. It's possible that it's there, but it's not as effective as I would have anticipated. This is the best example, and I'm not so sure it's a good example, but it's used in a sense to convey the feelings of apathy of Saitama and how he is bored of his life, and while it should be exciting, his life is bland to him. The directional flow was a bit difficult to find and get used to, due to the fact that this is a Japanese comic and reads from back to front and from right to left. So the panels read the same way. You started in the top right corner and read to the left and then followed as you would completely backwards of Western comics. That being said, the art and the flow, once figured out, moves well from one page to the next and one story to the next. The flow becomes more apparent once the cyborg is introduced in his story, and the bigger storyline for both of these characters becomes revealed. There are several flashbacks and some panels with much written dialogue that explains the cyborg's backstory. The author and the artist do make light of this at this point in the comic, but the information seems to be felt needed in order to move the bigger storyline forward and give the reader understanding. I found it very interesting, the use of motion lines and how prevalent they are in this particular comic. Many of the actions of the hero and the various villains were shown by not only motion lines but sound effect words as well. This is a very violent comic, and the fights Saitama becomes involved in and the sound effect words and motion all work and blend well to show the action of what's going on and how the story progresses. While my son enjoys the comic and has several of the books in this 12 comic book series, I found this comic a bit hard to follow and a bit too repetitive. I didn't mind the flashbacks, and I didn't mind that this comic is totally done in black and white. The repetition of the theme of boredom and overcoming evil was a bit much for me. There wasn't enough of a story arc or change in Saitama for my liking. I'm sure if I read more of this comic I might find more of a character arc, but in this first issue it's not present. I want to thank you for joining me in my journey to analyze the comic of One Punch Man. While this is not a comic I would read normally, I found the cultural differences to be intriguing and interesting, and by analyzing this particular Japanese manga, it helped me to learn to appreciate comics from a different perspective than what I'm used to. Again, thank you and good night.